And this is Vanessa Oyugi from the Center for African Studies at Howard University. Thank you so much. That was just a powerful start to the workshop, such a compelling and enlivening presentation. And thank you to the educators and the audience for such engaging, interesting questions and comments. It is my pleasure today to introduce the next presenter. Her name is Mora McClean. She is the President Emerita of the nonprofit Africa America Institute, AAI, and she's also the organization's historian, which makes her presentation today particularly special because William Leo Hansberry, the focus of this presentation, was one of the founders of AAI. Mora McClean is currently a doctoral candidate in American Studies at George Washington University. Her research aims to recover AAI's founding history in the 1950s, a time when Pan-Africanist conceptions of progress for Africa and its diaspora was in stark competition with the US liberal Cold War aspirations for African quote-unquote development. Now, forgive me, Mora, for this. I did not have to dig deep into the web to find this, but Mora's favorite color is blue. Her favorite food is fried plantain. Her favorite time of the year is spring, and her favorite vacation spot is US Virgin Islands, where she is from. Thank you, Mora, for being with us today. After your presentation, the audience will have a chance to engage you in a Q&A, which will be led by my colleague, Dr. Helen Bond. And I can go ahead and start sharing your presentation and you can begin. So let me go ahead and do that now. Mora, are you here?
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, it can.
Okay, great. I want to empathize with, I think it was Shane Carter, because I too am in recovery mode. So if I sound a little froggy, that's why. And hopefully I will, the coughing spasms have ceased. I want to also say just what an honor, truly an honor it is to have been invited to present at this workshop. Never, ever did I ever imagine that I would be on a program with Dr. Molefi Kete-Asante. And I am also as equally honored to be learning with K through 12 educators who are on the front lines. So thank you. So as we have can glean from Dr. Asante's amazing talk and exhortations, and as we know as students of history, history is never a thing of the past. It continuously lives on in the present and into the future. We can go to the next slide. This point was amply illustrated by a February 2021 New York Times Sunday Magazine feature article entitled, "He Wants to Save the Classics from Whiteness. Can the Field Survive?" The article reported on the controversy surrounding Daniel Padilla Peralta, a leading scholar of Roman antiquity who is Afro-Latino. Peralta was born in the Dominican Republic, emigrated to the United States as a child, and is on the faculty of the Classics Department at Princeton University. Peralta had come under scrutiny because of his scathing critique of classical studies. He called out the discipline for its embedded white male perspective, avoidance of introspection, and stubborn evasion of race, all factors which he alleged contribute to the discipline's racist appeal. The article noted that evidence of this racist appeal was on full display during the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, as they marched the streets White nationalists displayed Greco-Roman symbols as a way of purportedly tracing their roots to antiquity and legitimating white supremacy as a noble ancient cause. Next slide. Reading this New York Times article, I could not help but reflect on the fact that 100 years earlier, William Leo Hansberry, then also a young, impassioned Black scholar of the classics, embarked on an ambitious and controversial effort to center Africa in the origin story of quote unquote Western civilization. Hansberry's contributions as a Pan-Africanist and scholar activist, and his intellectual contributions to multiple fields, the classics, African studies, archaeology, and more, have been largely buried. In the 1920s, when Hansberry was an aspiring scholar, his ideas challenged the conventional wisdom across the mainstream disciplines in Europe and the United States, which adhered to the dictum of German philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Africa, declared Hegel, has no history. Next slide. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. Hansberry's work spanned 40 years of global upheavals. The crisis of the fall of the European Empire leading up to and after World War I, the rise of cultural anthropology and temporary retreat of scientific racism, the Great Depression and Popular Front against fascism, including the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, the convergence of decolonization in the so-called Third World with the Black struggle for human and citizenship rights in the United States, and the emergence of the United States as a global superpower during the ideological Cold War. Next slide. Hansberry family origins are deeply rooted in African American and Southern history. He was born in 1894 in Gloucester, Mississippi, to a tight-knit, purposeful family of Black Southerners. And as young adults, William Leo and his younger brother, Carl Augustus, joined the Great Migration to escape the humiliations and violence of the Jim Crow South. William Leo discovered the classics very early in life. His father, Eldon Hayes Hansberry, was a professor specializing in ancient Greek and Roman history at Alcorn College in Mississippi, which is, according to its website, the oldest public historically Black land-grant institution in the United States. It's now called Alcorn State University. Younger brother Carl Augustus was the successful plaintiff in Hansberry v. Lee, the 1940 landmark U.S. Supreme Court ruling that struck down a restrictive covenant, thus allowing him to purchase the family home in an all-white Chicago neighborhood. And Lorraine, Carl Augustus's youngest daughter and William Leo's niece, was the award-winning playwright whose credits include A Raisin in the Sun and Les Blancs. In 1916, while a freshman at Old Atlanta University, Hansberry read The Negro by W.E.B. Du Bois, and by his own account, the book changed his life. Hungry to learn more, Hansberry searched to find the additional books on Du Bois's recommended reading list, but they were nowhere to be found in Atlanta. Hence, 2 weeks into his sophomore year at Atlanta U, Hansberry abruptly packed his trunk and headed for Harvard, where he enrolled with the clear intention of pursuing a life of scholarship and activism. As you might imagine, for Hansberry, life at Harvard was, to borrow a phrase from Langston Hughes, no crystal stair. He had stepped into the lion's mouth. Among Hansberry's Harvard professors was the acclaimed American archaeologist George Andrew Reisner, who asserted that the Nubians who built the Egyptian pyramids could not possibly have been African. According to Reisner's biographer, quote, he had trouble wrapping his head around an indigenous great African Nubian civilization, unquote. But as a student, Hansberry challenged Reisner on this in class. In 1921, just before graduating Harvard, Hansberry wrote James Weldon Johnson, then head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, to propose that the NACP serve as a sponsor of a series of courses for Black teachers across the South. This is how urgent he saw this production and dissemination of knowledge mission to be. He turned down an offer from the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by Marcus Garvey, to join the history faculty at Howard University. Next slide. In a special article published in the Howard University Record in 1923, Hansberry wrote that the post-World War I zeitgeist, including the burgeoning interest in the new social sciences of anthropology and archaeology, afforded Howard a quote-unquote supreme opportunity to take the lead in establishing the first college-level African studies program in the US. Next slide. Historian Joseph Harris, the William Leo Hansberry history notebooks that he edited, has described Hansberry's mission as being revolutionary. What he was doing at Howard was revolutionary. Next slide. Among other things, and we can refer back to some of what we learned from Dr. Malefius Kete-Asante's keynote, Hansberry asserted that Africa, rather than Asia, was the birthplace of humanity. He wanted to do more research on the migration of African descendant peoples from the Sahara and Libyan deserts, which he attributed to desertification. He also alleged or asserted that many peoples and cultures of ancient Egypt originated in equatorial Africa and always maintained that Egypt was part of Africa. And that the peoples of Ethiopia vied with the mighty Assyrian Empire to be the preeminent civilization of the age. But perhaps, and the reason I highlight this, the most controversial, and remember, this is in the early 20th century, this is in the 1920s, Hansberry is proposing, quote, that Ghana, Mele, Songhai, Nupe were larger in size, more effectively organized, and higher in culture than most of the contemporary states of the Anglo-Saxon, the Germanic, and the Slavic regions of Europe. And again, this put him in the lion's mouth. Lacking some adequate support from Howard, and in the face of opposition from some of Howard's faculty, Hansberry persevered and assumed the burden of devising course curricula and creating course materials. There were no textbooks for him to draw upon. His efforts illuminate the politics of knowledge production. And, you know, at the risk of making this presentation way too voluminous, I did not include frames of the textbook that he created himself. And you can find this in the portions of the Harvard collection on Hansberry. And there's also a young scholar, Justin Donovan, who's written a wonderful article on this. Justin Donovan is an archaeologist. He's in the University of California system, and I can certainly include these among the resources for the workshop participants. Next slide. Not content to work exclusively within the ivory tower, Hansberry gave lectures hosted by community groups, and he's also known to have co-founded at least 2 impactful nonprofit advocacy organizations. Next slide. As we will learn from Professor Bob Edgar, in 1934, Hansberry joined forces with Dr. Melaku Bain to co-found the Ethiopian Research Council to protest the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. And 20 years later, in 1953, he joined forces with Horace Mann Bond and others to co-found the African American Institute. And it was when I joined AAI in the mid-1990s and was undertaking my own research to uncover the origins of this organization, which at the time was represented simply as an intermediary for US foreign aid assistance, that I discovered the certificate of incorporation, which has Hansberry, William Leo Hansberry, is one of the co-founders. And this got me onto this, the journey that I am continuing. Hopefully I can expand. We can talk about this more during the Q&A. Next slide. In 1964, the Haile Selassie Trust honored Hansberry by bestowing upon him its first Africa Prize. Horace Mann Bond, who had collaborated with him in the founding of AAI and on other projects, had nominated him for the prize. You can find the letter that Horace Mann Bond wrote in the Horace Mann Bond papers, which are at the University of Massachusetts Amherst collection. I included these two newspaper articles because I think it's just interesting to note how the Pittsburgh Courier reported on the prize. And this is just the headline from what was a full-length article and the really hardly discernible tiny article that the New York Times piece did at the same time. Next slide. Hansberry paid tribute to W.B. Du Bois, who was his mentor, in a piece, and I see that there's this particular frame has issues, but it's a wonderful essay in Freedom Ways, which Du Bois also had a part in founding the journal, Black Intellectual Journal. Shirley Graham Du Bois was among the editors. You can see the many contributors on the left-hand side, including Kwame Nkrumah and Nnamdi Azikiwe. But in Hansberry's piece, he goes into great depth about the impact that The Negro, authored by Du Bois and published in the very early 1900s, I believe it was around 1915, what an impact that had on his thinking and on his life. Next slide. Although Hansberry's life in the academy was mostly a struggle, he was the quintessential public intellectual. He collaborated with E. Harper Johnson, who was a very well-noted Black illustrator, on a history series that was published by Ebony Magazine between 1964 and 1965. And the plan was that this series, labeled Africa's Golden Pass, was to have been published in a book. But sadly, Hansberry died before the book was published. Next slide. After his death, he was eulogized by Nnamdi Azikiwe, who had been one of his former students, one of his many, many admiring former students, perhaps most of them African, at Howard. And in the eulogy, Azikiwe refers to the fact that a Hansberry Institute of African Studies had been established at the University of Nsukka. in Nigeria in honor of Hansberry. Next slide. That William Leo Hansberry, scholar of African antiquity, co-founder of the Ethiopian Research Council and the African American Institute, and teacher and mentor to Nnamdi Ezekwe and innumerable other African leaders, was the first to create a series of college-level courses in African civilizations anywhere in the United States at Howard University. In 1922 remains a little-known fact. He never earned a doctorate in African studies. There were no such programs in existence, but he nonetheless laid the foundation for the discipline. Earlier, I referenced the two-volume William Leo Hansberry African History Notebook, edited by Joseph Harris. This was something that was commissioned by Merle Kelso Hansberry after Hansberry's death. And credit needs to be given to Myrtle Hansberry. She typed Hansberry's manuscripts. She chauffeured him. He didn't drive. She would drive him wherever he needed to go. And she was also a scholar in her own right. She taught middle school French and reviewed books, including E. Franklin Fraser's The Black Family, and published a column. So I don't want to neglect to credit her. But increasingly, at least within the academy, Hansberry is gaining recognition. So for instance, in her 2018 presidential address, Jean Ullman critiqued the association's systematic erasure of Hansberry's singular contribution, not to mention the origins of the Pan-Africanist version of the discipline of African studies, as we heard from the keynote. In 2020, a transcontinental group of emerging Black scholars founded the Hansberry Society, which is, quote, dedicated to making the study of ancient Nile Valley and Northeast African cultures more inclusive to scholars of African descent. The two-volume history notebooks were reprinted by Black Classic Press, founded by Paul Coates. And I've included this example of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It's a headline from a Boston Public Radio program, which is easily accessed. An MFA exhibition tries to correct the record on misrepresented Asian Nubia. And in this piece, the interviewer references George Andrew Wisner, the Egyptologist who was one of Hansberry's teachers, and says, or the person interviewed says, George Andrew Wisner certainly got wrong this idea that the Nubians were never able to create any wonderful art or important monuments on their own. This is Denise Doxey, the curator of the Museum of Fine Arts. And, quote, she continued, Reisner attributed everything that was really of high artistic value or really monumental as being Egyptian influence at work, which is now known to be incorrect. So Hansberry's assertions about the Nubians, his challenge to George Reisner, we are seeing this revealed, and this kind of thing is happening at other museums that display African antiquity. Scholars who, like Daniel Padilla Peralta, are challenging the perpetuation of racist myths within the classics along with scholars who, like the members of the Hansberry Society, want to eliminate the artificial disciplinary silos that discourage and even preclude the integrated study of ancient Africa, the classics, Egyptology, Nubiology, etc., collectively identify Hansberry as having laid the foundation for transcending biases within and boundaries between these fields. But except for occasional allusions to his influence on the work of Lorraine Hansberry, the playwright, and his niece, remember the Nigerian boyfriend in The Raisin in the Sun, for instance, William Leo Hansberry remains largely obscure and unknown to the general public, and most important, or as important, to K through 12 educators. Happily, efforts, including this workshop, are underway to change this. Next slide. Hansberry envisioned the recovery of knowledge about African antiquity and the medieval era as essential for unhinging the inherent bias in the ways that Africa and its worldwide diaspora and their place in the world were and continue to be misunderstood and mischaracterized. Hopefully he will not remain the scholar nobody knows. Thank you.
Thank you, Mora. Thank you for the presentation. Dr. Bond, are you here?
Okay, I am. Thank you so much, Dr. Hugi. What a wonderful presentation, Mrs. McClean, Mora, if I might, for that. If you have questions or even comments, feel free to certainly put them in the chat or the Q&A, or you most certainly can raise your hand as well. And I'd like for the audience to think just very broadly. Oh, great, we have a question just starting out, so that's wonderful. Gertrude Williams.
Good morning, Dr. McClean. I'm a retired teacher, again, as I mentioned to the first presenter. But the problem is that how do we get authentic history books when the publishers are not allowing, or the districts are not allowing the schools to even know about this here? We can read or go to college and learn about all these things, or we on like this seminar, but to actually to infiltrate all this information into the public schools is very hard. So what would be your suggestions on that?
Should I respond or wait?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay.
Fresh.
Thank you so much for that question, Dr. Williams. There is a young scholar named Jarvis Givens, whom I commend to you. He's written a book called Fugitive Pedagogy. But even if reading the book is not something that you're inclined or that you have time to do, there's a wonderful piece that was published in the LA Review of Books that Jarvis Givens authored. And in that, he talks about this concept of fugitive pedagogy. And the point that he makes is that what we are experiencing today is nothing new. And that rather than wring our hands, we should go return to a long-standing tradition of formerly enslaved people and their descendants in the United States. And that is to take the education of our children into our own hands. And there is happily today, I mean, I was listening to one of your colleagues talk about what's going on in the Philadelphia schools. It breaks my heart. But today, unlike when I was in elementary school in the Virgin Islands, the former Danish West Indies, where I didn't learn Virgin Islands history in school, there is a wealth of scholarship, solid scholarship, young black and brown scholars that are writing about these things. And so initiatives like this workshop, the work of the Howard African Studies Center and the outreach that Vanessa and Brenda and others undertake so ably. The Africa America Institute, with which I have a long association, an ongoing association, also has a virtual conference. If I may make a brief promotion of our virtual conference on January 19th. I commend it to you, and we're going to be exploring the topic, what is the African diaspora and why should it matter to me? But the larger point I'm making is that we've never been able to depend on the mainstream American school and should not assume that we can do so now. And there are resources that can be deployed in the alternative. And I commend to you Jarvis Givets's essay in the LA book review of books on fugitive pedagogy.
Thank you. Was just checking to see if there are any more questions in the chat or the Q&A. I do see a recommendation there for teaching to transgress.
Yes, bell hooks, absolutely. And Gibbons references, his book is more recent, but he quotes bell hooks, no question.
While we generate some more questions, I know Mora that you mentioned in your talk that we might have refer back to this a little bit and the Q&A about what brought you to William Leo Hansberry in the first place. Is there a backstory you'd like to share with us?
There is, and I think this is was alluded to by Professor Asante. When I joined AAI in the mid-90s, it was represented as a U.S. government-funded intermediary. It certainly had, I was inspired to join it because I was aware of some of the work that it had done to support African students. So for instance, Barack Obama Sr. studied in the United States this is the father of the former president, at the University of Hawaii on a scholarship that was partially administered by the African American Institute. The Nobel laureate, Wangari Maathai, the Kenyan environmentalist, studied in the United States on an AAI administered scholarship, and I could go on and on. Nahasangula, Namibia's former education minister and a freedom fighter, likewise did undergraduate and graduate studies, but I knew nothing about the actual founding of the organization, and it bothered me that it was so. It seemed to be under a cloud. And so I began to dig myself because I've always been a historian at heart. And I found the certificate of incorporation in the office files, the 1953 certificate of incorporation. AAI was incorporated in Washington, D.C., and among the 5 names was William Leo Hansberry. And I thought, and so, for me, this is yet another example of how history is not something we can take for granted, that history is both what happened, it's what is said about what happened, and everything in between. And I'm borrowing from Silencing the Past with that crude distillation. But so my discovery, my desire to uncover the founding history of AAI was emerged from my own experience of working with an organization whose institutional history had been long buried.
Thank you for that. We're going to have to close on that question. What a wonderful presentation. I just want to add really quickly, I was really interested in the letter, Horace Mann Bond. It's actually a relative of my father, James Bond. So always happy to make a
Well, we have to
connection.
talk.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. So thank you, and I'll pass the baton back to Dr. Uwuji. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Bond. Thank you so much, Mora. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to be working with you and AAI. And so thank you so much for spending your time with us today and sharing your research. Thank you. Let me share my screen. All right. What we'll be doing now is going over a brief reflection session. My colleague Awa Saidi and I. Let's see. All right, and this is about this particular presentation that we just heard from Mrs. Mora McClean, Hansberry. Now, why is Hansberry important in the context of our workshop with the theme of silencing history, and in which ways did he encounter silencing? And we've learned that, obviously, through both of the presentations, that Hansberry faced many challenges as he was trying to push the agenda to create the field for it to stand on its own. And even after having successfully created and contributed to the field, he still didn't receive the credit that was due. And even to this day, research on him is more sparse than it perhaps ought to be. And the reality is that Hansberry's work and the creation of African studies occurred in a context of just racially unequal world on many levels. I mean, institutionally, in terms of funding, in terms of his recognition, and obviously the very content of his work. But how do you get your students to learn about Hansberry and African studies? Awa, would you like to read out some research questions that you can give students? Awa, are you here?
Yes, I am here. Sorry.
No problem.
Thank you, Vanessa. Vanessa prepared some questions, and I think these are really good questions that teachers can share with students. And so starting with the first question, who was William Leo Hansberry? I think this is a really good question. It's simple, but I think it's really a critical question as well, just knowing him. What knowledge did he produce about Africa? When did he produce this information? How did he share his knowledge? Where did he promote his findings about Africa? Why did he feel it was important to have knowledge about Africa? Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Awa. Yes, I think setting the historical context is really important when telling his story. So, to be able to shed light on the specific challenges and also the opportunities of his time. So I think that these questions can give a good foundation for understanding Hansberry and his greater purpose. I mean, to answer these questions, you can start off with having students just browse the web, and they will likely find these web articles on Hansberry. Now, obviously, these sites should be approached with caution, as any sources should, but they are a great starting point to whet students' appetite to learn more. So we have, for example, the Hansberry Society that Mora McClean just mentioned, which was started by a group of Black scholars, archaeologists, Ethiopianists, and just African studies scholars who are addressing the lack of diversity in their fields and also the silence that they have been confronted with when they're discussing racial injustices. And so they organize discussions and events on the topic, so it'd be good to kind of stay tapped into them. And understanding their mission itself is a good place to start the framing for students to understand the framing of the challenges that Hansberry faced and that we still face in the academies. And there's an article on the Black past, which is simply a brief profile on Hansberry. And on encyclopedia.com, there's a longer biographical piece. It is quite long. That does have some great information and points of view, which can get students thinking. Then the article on Medium. So have you heard about, you have heard about Leo Hansberry, but do you know who her Uncle Leo is? So at least you can make the connection to Hansberry's niece, Lorraine, and it endearingly calls him Uncle Leo, which I find great. So, and also the title itself just emphasizes the important point about this obscureness of his work, where it should be much more well-known. And then we get to the real sauce, the primary sources. Now, Mora's presentation has highlighted so many really great sources, more than what we have right here. Well, I'll briefly mention them again. And all of this, you know, just so you know that this presentation, this PowerPoint, will be accessible to you, and each one of these are clickable links, so that it'll take you to a research folder that we have for you, that you can access. So we have the article here that Mrs. McClean showed us. It's entitled Howard's Supreme Opportunity, where's this one right here, which was published in the Howard University Record, which was a university magazine, which was published about 4 times in a year and represented the life and the work of the institution. And it's easily accessible via Howard University website. And then this one right here, The Scholar Nobody Knows, that was an Ebony article, and this article is available as part of the Special Collections and University Archives by the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So you can also access this entire article there. We also put it in our folder for you. And then all the way to the right, we have the eulogy that Mora mentioned, the eulogy by former Nigerian President Nnamdi Azikiwe, which is a very powerful piece to showcase the real impact that Hansberry had. Oh, what did I do? That's not what I meant to. Oh, because I clicked on it. Okay, sorry. Let me just. Okay, here we go. And so after all the research, the students the students have undertaken to get a sense of who Hansberry was, of what his purpose was, the historical context that informed everything. You can get the students started on some projects, and here are just some simple ideas that they can create a historical figure profile that could include quotes, facts, dates, to get to the historical importance of this person and his broader purpose. And they can do some perspective writing or some role play, speech writing, in which they write or perform a short piece as if they were Hansberry or somebody associated with Hansberry. Just some ideas. And if you'd like to dig deeper on race and the politics of knowledge production in African studies, definitely watch that ASA presidential lecture by Jean Elman that Mora also mentioned. It definitely problematizes white scholars like Melville Herskovits, who have been arguably celebrated more visibly than Black Africanists like Hansberry. So this is it's definitely a great speech to listen to. There's all, oh, how do I go to the next page? There we go. Oh, I keep on doing it. Why is it? Okay, there we go. There's also a documentary on Melville Herskovits that is accessible for free on the site called Alexander Street. But I think it does have to go through an institution. So you just have to check in. It was quite easy going through Howard. I mean, you just went to the site, and then if you enter your institution and your institution is part of this, then it would be available for free. Otherwise, it's available for, was it $2.99 on Vimeo? Then I just included a quote here that I don't want to get into too much, but it's a quote that you could use from Melville Herskovits, which you could use to problematize the assertions of white scholars such as Herskovits, because it reveals the obvious biases that are quite problematic, especially if we don't amplify the Black and the African voices at the same time. So this, you know, you can look into this quote. I don't want to take any more time. It is in the website, and it is also mentioned in the ASA presidential lecture. And lastly, here is in this PowerPoint presentation is the access to the folder, and it has lots of, maybe I can click on it just to show you. Are you able to see what I'm showing? Yes, so a lot of the primary sources that were mentioned by Mrs. Mora McClean and myself are also in here. So I hope these will be useful resources for you and your students. Thank you.